This is public land, and I'm taking it back." The self-proclaimed Ho Queen shrieked, slamming her hammer against my no trespassing sign posted at the edge of my wooden cabin. She charged in like a storm, police trailing behind her, smug satisfaction painted all over her face as she tried to kick me out of my own home. Sirens echoed through the air, neighbors poured outside to witness the chaos. My chest tightened, but instead of panicking, I let a slow smile spread across my face. With calm hands, I opened my gate and pulled out a deed powerful enough to shatter this entire hoe's grip. She thought the upper hand belonged to her, but the truth was about to swing hard in the other direction. Where are you tuning in from? Drop a comment now because this story is only beginning. I'd been living in my grandfather's cabin in the Pinehurst community for 3 years. Each morning carried a routine: black coffee on the deck, watching the Colorado sun seep through the towering pines that had stood for decades as long before the glossy, oversized mansions began popping up like overpriced wheats. That particular morning should have been peaceful. I was tightening a loose deck board, remembering how Dad had promised to help me restore this place before cancer stole him from us. The scent of pine and fresh lumber usually eased me, but not today. Something in the air crackled with tension, like the stillness right before a storm. Then I heard the sharp clack of high heels crunching gravel. That sound came paired with the presence of someone who wielded authority without ever having earned it. I looked up to see Tamara Caldwell marching straight for my property line, a bubblegum pink tablet pressed tight against her chest like armor. She was dressed in a spotless white blazer, probably worth more than my monthly bills. Confidence radiated from her, the kind that only comes from being elected to run and hoe in a neighborhood where most residents are too busy to care and too tired to vote. "Good morning, Mr. Colt," she called out, her tone dipped in artificial sweetness, the kind of voice people use when they're about to wreck your day. "I'm performing a compliance review of all homes in the Heritage District. Unfortunately, your cabin has several concerning violations." She raised her tablet as if it held divine wisdom, flipping through what looked like photos of my so-called offenses. The morning sun glinted off the screen, revealing she'd been documenting everything probably since dawn. Harassing me had become her full-time hobby. Setting my coffee down, I walked to the edge of the deck and kept my voice calm. "I'm not sure what violations you're referring to, Tamara. My grandfather built this cabin in 1962, long before any hoe even existed here. I have every original permit and a deed to prove it, if you'd like to see them." Truth be told, I'd been carrying copies of those documents in my back pocket ever since Tamara took office 3 months ago. Something about her victory speech where she promised to raise the aesthetic standards of our community had set off every alarm in me. 20 years in construction teaches you how to spot the difference between leadership and tyranny. Tamara's smile stayed frozen in place, but her eyes turned to ice. "Mr. Colt, I'm afraid those outdated documents no longer apply. The Pinehurst Community Heritage Preservation Board has new guidelines. Your cabin fails to meet setback requirements, uses non-period materials, and most importantly, intrudes on public green space by roughly 3.2 feet. She delivered that last part with the pride of someone who thought she'd solved world hunger. My jaw clenched, but I stayed steady. "Tamara, there is no Heritage Preservation Board. I confirmed it with the county last month. This land has been in my family for 60 years. I pulled out my phone and showed her photos of the original property survey. "See these boundary markers? They've stood in the same place since my grandfather hammered them in. The only thing shifting here is your goalpost." It was a small jab, but the twitch in her face made it worth it. Behind her, a clipboard-wielding assistant tried his best to blend into the scenery. That alone told me this scene wasn't his first rodeo. Then Tamara made her first critical mistake. She went live. I watched her flip the tablet to selfie mode, her voice suddenly morphing into the fake, performative tone people use when addressing an unseen audience. "Hello, preservation warriors. I'm standing here at the illegal cabin we've discussed, where the owner refuses to cooperate with our community improvement efforts." She swung the camera toward my cabin, narrating like she was a documentary host. "Notice how this structure completely disregards our carefully designed aesthetic guidelines and even trespasses into what should be shared community space. That's when I realized what was happening. She was launching a social media campaign to pit my own neighbors against me, people I'd helped countless times. Starting their cars, hauling groceries, fixing fences were suddenly her audience, rooting for my removal. Tell you what, I said, stepping closer to the property line, why don't you make whatever call you need to, and I'll grab my paperwork. We can end this right now with facts, not theater. I gestured at her tablet, and maybe turn off the live stream. This is between neighbors, not for strangers' entertainment. But I could see her follower count climbing by the second. She wasn't going to stop a conflict, was content, and content meant power in her world. Her mask finally slipped. Mr. Colt, I am the duly elected president of this HOA, and I have the authority to enforce community standards. If you continue to obstruct this process, I'll have no choice but to involve law enforcement. She never broke eye contact with her camera, making sure her audience absorbed every word. Our community deserves better than individuals who think rules don't apply to them. The way she spit out the word individuals made it sound like a curse. At that moment, my 16-year-old son, Tommy, stepped out of the cabin, drawn by the commotion. He instantly pulled out his phone and started recording from another angle. Dad, he whispered, she's got like 50,000 followers on TikTok. This isn't just about our house anymore. Tommy's tone carried more weight than I expected. His quiet concern made it clear this wasn't just a property squabble anymore. It was a live-streamed character assassination, carefully staged for an audience that only knew Tamara's version of the truth. I glanced at my son, then at Tamara still preening for her camera, and finally at the cabin my grandfather built with his own hands after returning from Korea. The sunlight caught the edges of the old timbers, showing off the precise craftsmanship in every beam. To me, this wasn't just a house, it was proof that real work and family legacy still mattered in a world where people like Tamara confused clout with authority, and performance with leadership. What I didn't realize then was that Tamara's pink tablet wasn't just gathering evidence. It was laying the groundwork for something much larger and more dangerous than a neighborhood squabble. She wasted no time making good on her threats. Barely half an hour after her live stream ended, the crunch of tires on gravel echoed down my driveway. Two police cruisers rolled up. Detective Sarah Kent stepped out of the first car, mid-40s, streaks of gray in her hair, wearing the wary expression of someone who had mediated too many neighbor feuds that spiraled out of control. From the second car emerged Officer Martinez, younger, clearly hoping this would be nothing more than a quick call that didn't require paperwork. But what caught my attention wasn't the officer, it was Tamara. In the short time since she left, she had managed to upgrade her setup. The flimsy pink tablet was gone, replaced by a full camera rig complete with tripod and external mic. She wasn't documenting anymore, she was producing. "Good morning, Mr. Colt," Detective Kent greeted me, her tone careful, her pace measured. "We've received a complaint about a boundary dispute and possible trespassing. May we see your documentation?" Her voice was professional, not hostily, a sign she dealt with HOA theatrics before and knew better than to pick sides too quickly. Behind her, Tamara was already busy adjusting her equipment with practiced precision, angling the lens so it would capture both me and the police officers, with my illegal cabin framed perfectly in the background. She even repositioned twice to make sure the lighting hit just right. I handed over the folder I'd been carrying for months: a original deed, the 1962 survey, and every permit tied to improvements my grandfather had made. "This cabin has been in my family since it was built," I explained. "I've never joined any HOA, never signed a single agreement. And according to these surveys, I'm well inside my property lines." Officer Martinez leaned closer, flipping through the pages with Kent. I caught him giving a sidelong glance at Tamara's setup with the look of a man who knew a performance when he saw one. That's when Earl Morrison appeared. From the corner of my eye, I saw him shuffle down the gravel path from his house next door. 70 years old, shoulders bowed from decades of carrying invisible weight, clutching a manila envelope against his chest as though it contained classified secrets. Earl had lived in Pinehurst longer than anyone still alive, except maybe my grandfather's memory. "Detective," he said softly, his voice trembling, "there's something you need to know about all this." His hand shook, but his eyes were steady. And the way he carefully avoided Tamara's camera told me immediately whatever he carried in that envelope, it wasn't going to support her side of the story. Tamara reacted instantly, her composure cracking for the first time since I'd met her. She rushed forward, her voice bright but edged with panic. "Mr. Morrison, really, there's no reason for you to involve yourself in this legal matter. I'm sure you have your own property to maintain without worrying about zoning issues that don't concern you." But the way she tried to plant herself between Earl and Detective Kent wasn't leadership, it was damage control. Earl straightened his back, and for a moment, I glimpsed the younger man he must have once been before secrets wore him down. He looked directly at me. "Son," he said, his voice firmer now, "what I'm about to tell these officers I should have spoken up about 40 years ago. This isn't just about your cabin. This whole HOA broken bar, it was built on something that wasn't right from the beginning." With steady hands, he opened the envelope. Detective Kent's interest sharpened, shifting from routine property complaint to something heavier. Tamara, though she resumed filming, had lost her confident narration. Kent studied the contents carefully, asking questions Earl answered like he had rehearsed every word for decades. Though I couldn't see the documents clearly, they were enough to make Officer Martinez pull out a notepad and start writing. The air grew warmer under the rising sun, yet a chill ran through me. This wasn't the simple fight over property lines I'd prepared for. This was bigger, rooted in decisions made long before Tamara ever walked into this neighborhood. Finally, Detective Kent closed my folder and said, "Mr. Colt, based on what I'm seeing here, this situation requires more investigation than we can handle in a single call. I recommend you contact a property attorney and make sure all your records are in order." Then she turned her attention toward Tamara, whose camera was still rolling. "Miss Caldwell," Kent said firmly, "I'm going to need you to." Detective Kent's voice shifted when she addressed Tamara. It wasn't loud or aggressive, but the edge of authority was there. "Miss Caldwell, shut the camera off. You're on private property without permission, and we'll need to schedule a formal interview to review these land records." It was subtle, but the change in tone told me everything. Whatever Earl had shared in that envelope had tipped the balance. Tamara's mask slipped entirely. Instead of backing down, she let her camera keep rolling, spiraling into a meltdown in front of her growing audience. "This right here is the corruption destroying our communities," she shouted, waving her arms between the police and my cabin. "Good citizens like me try to uphold fair standards, and what happens? We get treated like criminals, while illegal structures are protected by some old boys network." Her voice grew shriller with each word. On the display screen of her camera, I saw her follower count climbing as the outrage drew more viewers. The calm, collected community leader persona that had gotten her elected was gone. What remained was desperation as someone realizing control was slipping through her fingers. From the deck, Tommy had been quietly observing. As the officers prepared to leave, he came forward, phone in hand. "Dad," he said carefully. While she was ranting, I looked her up. He turned his screen towards me, showing a list of Tamara's social media posts. "She's been targeting families here for months. Not just USA, 12 different households, same routine. Photos of so-called violations, then posts rallying people to take action." What I thought was her personal grudge against our cabin was just a small piece of a much bigger campaign. Detective Kent and Officer Martinez eventually headed back to their cruisers. But Earl didn't move. He lingered at the property line, looking like a man who had just dropped a burden he'd carried for too many years. "Grady," he said, calling me by my first name for the first time since I'd lived here. "What I showed those officers today, it's going to change things. And you ought to know a broken bar. Your grandfather wasn't only protecting this cabin when he held on to certain papers, he was protecting something much larger, bigger than any of us realized at the time." The weight in his words made my stomach tighten. Whatever truth Earl carried, it dwarfed Tamara's petty hoe crusade. What I didn't realize that morning was that the manila envelope he held was more than evidence. It was the key to unraveling not just my dispute, but the entire foundation of how Pinehurst was built. That afternoon, Earl invited Tommy and me into his home. Walking through his door was like stepping back decades in time. The air smelled of old books and cedar, and the worn furniture groaned under our weight as we sat. Earl disappeared into a back room and returned with a shoebox. Its cardboard edges were frayed, its surface faded from years of being hidden. He placed it gently on the coffee table. His hands weren't trembling anymore, but the deliberate care with which he set it down told me this box had been a heavy burden. "Your grandfather and a broken bar. We had an understanding," Earl began, lowering himself into his recliner. "Back in '85, when the developer Jonathan Hayes showed up talking about turning this place into a planned community, your granddad knew something was off. Hayes was offering to buy a land he didn't even own, using survey maps that had been doctored to make private property look like it was marked for development." He opened the shoebox. Inside were piles of documents, faded photographs, and several cassette tapes sealed in plastic bags. "I was the county surveyor back then," Earl continued. "Hayes offered me more money than I'd ever seemed to stay quiet about the false records." Tommy leaned forward, eyes wide with curiosity, snapping photos on his phone. "The broken bar. Are you saying this whole neighborhood was built illegally?" The question hung heavy in the room. If Earl was right, then Tamara's HOA wasn't just overstepping authority, it was built on stolen ground. Earl gave a slow nod and picked up one of the plastic-wrapped tapes. "That's exactly what I'm saying, son. And your grandfather, he figured it out before anyone else. He documented everything, recordings, copies, evidence." He handed me one of the tapes. On the label was my grandfather's neat handwriting. "Hayes Meeting Number 3A, March 1985. After your grandfather passed in '87, I thought maybe the whole mess would disappear with him," Earl admitted, his voice thinning as if the years themselves weighed him down. Hayes had moved on to new projects, and most folks seemed content with their shiny houses and neighborhood perks. But when Tamara got herself elected last year and started waving around claims about heritage preservation and community land, I realized the fraud was alive and well. She's been using Hayes's fake surveys to grab private property under the guise of community development. He dug back into the shoebox and pulled out a thick manila folder stuffed with photocopies. "I made duplicates of everything your granddad collected. Every conversation he recorded, every doctored map, every offer Hayes slipped across the table." Before I could respond, Tommy was already setting up Earl's battered old stereo, connecting his laptop with the ease of someone who lived and breathed tech. "Mr. Morrison," he said, eyes scanning the tapes like priceless relics, "do you have digital backups of any of this? Because if we're going to prove fraud that stretches back 4 decades, cassette tapes and photocopies aren't going to cut it." Earl hesitated, then shuffled into the bedroom. When he returned, he was holding something that made my heart stutter, a USB drive sealed in a plastic bag. Across the tape was my grandfather's familiar handwriting. "Insurance policy. In case something happens." "He gave me this the week before he died," Earl said, handing it to me as if passing on a sacred heirloom. "Made me promise to keep it hidden, only to be used if Hayes or someone like him ever came back to finish the job." I'd say Tamara fits that description. My hands trembled as I peeled away the plastic. Just imagining my grandfather's final days, knowing he spent them making sure his family was protected, tightened something in my chest. Tommy plugged the drive into his laptop. In seconds, the screen filled with fileless audio recordings, scanned documents, even untouched property surveys predating Hayes's alterations. Broken bar," Tommy whispered as he scrolled. "This isn't just proof of fraud. This is a full-blown conspiracy." The screen displayed long-forgotten email chains between Hayes and county officials, laying out a systematic plan to carve up private land for development. Fake maps, bribed inspectors, paper trails disguised as updates. Then Tommy opened one of the audio files. Hayes's voice came through clearly, smooth and confident, speaking to someone identified as County Supervisor Wilson. They were discussing how to quietly adjust property boundaries to create communal spaces that would inflate property values. The date on the recording stopped me cold as 6 months before my grandfather died. In the background of the tape, I could hear the faint sound of papers rustling in my grandfather, documenting everything. "If anyone questions the old surveys," Hayes's voice drawled, "we'll just claim the records were lost in a filing system update. By the time anyone digs into it, the community will be too valuable for anyone to risk upsetting." Tommy paused the playback and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on him before, a mix of horror, determination, and the stubborn spark that reminded me so much of his mother. Broken bar. These original surveys say our property line stretches all the way to where Tamara's house is right now. His voice hardened. She's not just wrong about our cabin being on community land. She's living on our land. The weight of it hit like a hammer. The woman who'd been demanding I abandon my family's home was herself standing on stolen ground. Earl watched us absorb the revelation, his eyes heavy with secrets finally seeing daylight. "There's more," he said, pulling another folder free. "Hayes didn't stop with your family. According to these files, he ran the same scheme on at least 12 other properties in Pinehurst. Every so-called community space, every house built on land bought too cheap, and it was all stolen the same way." The scale of it was staggering. This wasn't a power-hungry HOA president we were up against. It was the lingering shadow of a decades-old criminal enterprise that had shaped our entire neighborhood. As Tommy uploaded files and Earl sorted through 4 decades of hidden evidence, a thought gnawed at me. If my grandfather had all this proof, why hadn't he used it? What had stopped him from exposing Hayes and protecting his neighbors while he was still alive? The answer to that question lay buried somewhere on the USB drive, and I had the sinking feeling that uncovering why my grandfather stayed silent would be harder to stomach than the fraud itself. Tommy eventually unearthed a final audio file, tucked away deep in the folders. The date stamped on it was just days before my grandfather's death. His voice sounded weak, strained at a broken bar but resolute as he began to speak. The recording wasn't addressed to me, but to someone unfamiliar. My grandfather's voice, frail yet steady, carried a chilling weight. "Earl, if something happens before I can bring Hayes down, you need to know why I never went public." He didn't just threaten me, he threatened my son, my future grandkids, anyone carrying the family name. Hayes has people in the courthouse, the sheriff's office, even the state planning commission. Taking him on isn't just taking on one mana, it's challenging an entire network that could wipe out my family's future in Colorado. The message ended with the sound of his labored breathing, followed by the soft shuffle of papers being sealed at the very envelope Earl had kept hidden for 40 years. Earl broke down as the final words faded, decades of guilt finally crashing through in uncontrollable sobs. "He made me swear to wait," Earl choked out. "Wait until Hayes was gone, a broken bar, or until someone like Tamara forced us to act. Your granddad knew this fraud would resurface, and when it did, we'd have everything we needed to stop it." But in '85, going after Hayes meant losing everything your family had built. I found myself weeping too, and not just for the grandfather I'd barely known, but for the impossible choice he'd carried, justice or survival. While I tried to steady myself, Tommy worked methodically, organizing the digital files, while Earl and I placed a call to Marcus Webb, an old construction buddy of mine who had shifted into property law after an injury ended his building career. Marcus arrived half an hour later, and the moment he saw the spread of documents and recordings covering Earl's table, he let out a sharp whistle. "Grady," he said, scanning the files on Tommy's laptop, "this isn't just fraud. What you've got here is proof of an ongoing criminal conspiracy, one that still involves sitting county officials. Some of these email addresses are still active. Hayes's network is alive." That's when the buzzing whine of a drone reached us. Through the window, we spotted Tamara in the street, operating professional-grade aerial equipment, documenting the neighborhood like she was conducting an environmental impact study for her online followers. Her setup was more advanced than ever: multiple cameras, high-end and mix-sensitive enough to catch conversations through glass. She was systematically building a digital dossier on every property, the foundation for her next land grab. Marcus shook his head, his lawyer's instincts kicking in. "She's surveilling private property without permission. That's illegal. And more importantly, she's creating a paper trail that will collapse once we show she has no legal authority." According to Hayes's own conversations, the original HOA charter was built on fake boundaries. "If we prove that, everything Tamara has done as HOA president gets erased." Earl, no longer hunched with guilt, leaned forward with a new energy like a man finally freed. "There's something else," he said, pulling out a hand-drawn survey from the bottom of the shoebox. "These are my records from before Hayes started shifting lines. By my measurements, Tamara's house sits entirely on Grady's property. She's been squatting for 3 years without realizing it. Tommy's fingers flew across his laptop as he cross-referenced Tamara's social media history with Hayes' old fraud timeline. "Dad, look at this," he said, spinning the screen toward us. "She's following Hayes' exact playbook. First, she marks the properties she wants. Then, she builds public support online. Finally, she uses HOA authority to make the grab look legitimate." The resemblance was too precise to be coincidence. Tamara wasn't just repeating his story, she was deliberately reviving it. Marcus leaned over Earl's hand-drawn map, his expression shifting from detached professionalism to astonishment. "Do you realize what this means?" he asked, spreading the map beside the laptop. "If these surveys are accurate, Tamara's house isn't the only one. The community center, the playground, even half the main road, they're all sitting on land that was stolen." The sheer scope of potential restitution was staggering. We weren't talking about just my family's cabin anymore, but dozens of families who'd been stripped of their property over 40 years. Outside, Tamara's drone pressed closer, hovering over Earl's home, peering through windows. It was an invasion of privacy, yes, but also a critical mistake. Every second she recorded was creating evidence we could eventually turn against her. Every second Tamara's drone hovered above us, it was logging data, video, location, timestamps, all of it forming a trail that would later prove she had been conducting unauthorized surveillance on private property. "Marcus," I said, watching the machine tilt toward our windows for a better angle, "I think it's time we plan a community gathering. The neighbors need to know what's really happening in Pinehurst." Tommy was already working on it, scrolling through social media threads and chats. "Dad, I've been reaching out to some of the other families she's gone after. They've all dealt with the same litany of fake citations, threats about supposed community property, demands to tear down or correct things that have stood for decades." He turned his laptop toward us, showing screenshots of complaints from residents I barely knew, each describing the exact same harassment. It was no longer about one cabin. This was a campaign of intimidation disguised as leadership. Earl stood at the window, watching the drone circle above his house like a mechanical buzzard. "You know what your grandfather would say if he saw this?" His voice had a strength I hadn't heard in years. "He'd say it's time to stop hiding from bullies and fight back with the truth." The man who had carried 40 years of shame and silence was gone, replaced by someone ready to stand tall again. None of us realized at that moment that the very footage Tamara was gathering would soon become the evidence that destroyed her authority. The community emergency meeting was held in the same elementary school gym where Tamara had been voted HOA president months earlier, but the atmosphere was nothing alike. This wasn't a casual neighborhood check-in. More than 200 residents filled folding chairs, local news crews lined the walls, and the air was thick with tension. People had come to find out whether their homes, their history, even their sense of security had been based on lies. Tamara had transformed the front of the gym into a stage. Spotlights lit up poster-sized property maps, a sound system that could have filled a concert hall boomed, and a stack of binders and charts stood like props in a courtroom drama. Marcus had warned us to let her speak first, knowing her theatrics would only make our evidence cut deeper when the time came. She launched into a 45-minute PowerPoint extravaganza titled "Protecting Our Community Heritage, the Legal Framework for Property Compliance." 37 slides of graphs, pictures, and bullet points, all crafted to paint my cabin as a parasite draining the life out of Pinehurst. Her polished presentation had some neighbors nodding, unsettled by her claims that unapproved structures were ruining the carefully designed aesthetic harmony of the community. The climax came when she unveiled what she called her definitive proof: drone footage of my cabin and nearby properties, digitally overlaid with manipulated property lines. The video was slick, narrated in her confident voice, with swelling background music that made my grandfather's old wooden home appear like an invader encroaching on sacred community ground. "As you can clearly see," Tamara declared, brimming with self-assurance, "this so-called cabin is a blatant violation of our founding principles. It must be removed to restore the proper heritage of this district." That's when Marcus rose from his seat. He asked for a moment to respond, and the gym fell quiet. Connecting Tommy's laptop to the projector, he filled the screen with a very different set of documents, aged, stamped, and far more official than anything Tamara had shown. "Ladies and gentlemen, he said in the steady tone of someone who had spent years in courtrooms. "What you are about to see proves that the legal foundation of this HOA and Ms. Caldwell's authority as its president is built on fraudulent property transfers that date back decades." The crowd rippled with uneasy murmurs, and Tamara's mask of confidence began to crack. Then Marcus played the audio recording. Jonathan Hayes, caught in conversation with county officials about altering boundary lines. The room went still. You could practically feel 200 people struggling to process what it meant that their neighborhood's very history was tainted by fraud. Marcus let the weight of that revelation settle before continuing. He pulled up Earl's hand-drawn surveys, explaining how the original property lines differ drastically from the maps Tamara had been using to justify her enforcement campaign. "According to these surveys," he said, pointing to highlighted sections on the projection screen, "many of the structures Miss Caldwell has been targeting are not violations at all, but rightful property that was stolen on paper decades ago." Several of the structures Tamara had flagged as community property, including the playground and even the community center, were, according to the old surveys, actually sitting on land that legally belonged to individual homeowners. The heart of our case came when Earl stepped forward. 70 years old, carrying decades of guilt, he finally told the truth. Standing in front of his neighbors, he spoke clearly and steadily about the threats Jonathan Hayes had made, the bribes he'd been offered to falsify maps, and the crushing weight of silence he'd carried ever since. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," Earl said at last, "but I am asking you to help us fix what should have been corrected 40 years ago." The standing ovation wasn't just for his courage, it was for the community itself, finally recognizing they had all been deceived by the same fraud. Tamara's reaction was everything we had hoped for, and worse. Rather than addressing the evidence, she unraveled in front of the entire gym, pointing furiously at the projection screen, still showing Hayes's incriminating emails. She shouted, "This is conspiracy nonsense. You're being manipulated by a handful of bitter residents who can't accept reasonable community standards." Her voice rose with every sentence, and I watched her shift from leader to cornered pretender as the crowd's mood changed, first confused, then doubtful, and finally openly hostile. The final blow came when the county recorder, invited by Marcus to verify our documents, stood and addressed the room with the calm weight of legal authority. "Based on the evidence shown tonight," she said firmly, "it is clear that multiple property transfers within Pinehurst were based on altered surveys. The county will be opening an immediate investigation, and all HOA decisions under Miss Caldwell are hereby suspended until these boundary disputes are resolved." The gym exploded with chatter. Neighbors turned to one another in shock, realizing their property lines, fees, and even leadership had been built on fraud. Meanwhile, Tommy had been streaming the entire meeting live. As we packed away our files, he showed me the number, so over 12,000 people were watching in real time. Messages from across the country poured in, stories from others facing HOA abuse, encouragement, gratitude, outrage. "Dad," he said, his eyes wide, "this isn't about just our cabin anymore. We're proving that people can fight back against corruption and actually win." The boy who had once been terrified about losing his father's property had grown into an advocate for justice. As the crowd slowly filed out, neighbors approached us, some thanking us for exposing the truth, others offering to help with the investigation. Mrs. Patterson, whose garden shed Tamara had ordered demolished just weeks before, hugged Earl through tears. "Thank you for finally standing up. Some of us knew something was wrong, but we didn't know how to fight." The community Tamara had fractured through fear was already beginning to mend itself, bound together by the recognition that they'd all been living under the same deception. But outside, in the parking lot, I spotted her. Tamara stood alone, clutching her thick folders, talking quickly into her phone. One look at her posture told me she wasn't surrendering, as she was regrouping. The night's humiliating defeat hadn't broken her. If anything, it had made her more dangerous. We had won the community's support and exposed a 40-year fraud, but the fight was far from over. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of heavy machinery and shouted orders outside my cabin. Through the window, I saw construction crews working with precision and urgency, men installing tall metal fencing topped with razor wire, cutting my property in half as if it were a prison yard. The foreman, clipboard in hand, kept pointing toward my cabin, shaking his head like it was nothing more than an obstacle in his way. Tommy was already on the deck, phone in hand, documenting everything. "Dad," he said, his voice tied with disbelief, "you need to see these a broken bar, Dad. They started at 4 in the morning," Tommy said, sweeping his phone camera across the growing wall of fencing. "And it's not just USA. They've cut off the Hendersons, Mrs. Patterson's garden, even Earl's driveway. She's fencing in half the neighborhood." The scale of the construction hit me like a punch. This wasn't some impulsive tantrum after last night's humiliation. Tamara had planned this nuclear option well in advance, a last-ditch effort to cling to power after the community rejected her. By dawn, workers had finished installing a towering electronic gate at what they decided was the main entrance of their makeshift compound. None of the trapped residents were given the code. In effect, 6 households had been sealed inside their own properties. Earl stood on his porch in a bathrobe, staring at the razor wire fence that now separated him from his mailbox, his face twisted in disbelief. Across the way, Mrs. Patterson was already documenting the damage to her prize-winning rose beds now sliced in two by the steel barrier. Her expression wasn't just one of shock, but of quiet determination, the look of someone preparing to take her case to court. The press descended almost immediately. Within hours, news vans lined the street, reporters broadcasting live about the HOA president who had literally built a prison around her neighbors. Social media carried the story even faster. Tommy coordinated with residents to live stream from multiple angles, turning the entire fiasco into a real-time documentary of what was fast becoming the most infamous home meltdown in Colorado history. Marcus soon arrived with Detective Kent and half the county's legal staff in tow. They carried stacks of documents and wore expressions that said even their years in public service hadn't prepared them for something this outrageous. "Good news and bad news," Marcus called through the fence, his voice edged with both exasperation and disbelief. "The good news, Tamara just handed us the strongest evidence imaginable that she has no legal claim over this property. The bad news, it'll take a few hours to get the paperwork filed so we can officially tear this thing down." It was then I realized Tamara had made the same mistake as Jonathan Hayes decades before. In her obsession with projecting control, she'd thrown away the illusion of legitimacy. The fence wasn't just a physical blockade, it was an outright confession. Every news clip, every photo of neighbors trapped behind steel and razor wire, every live stream of families cut off from their own streets, all of it would fuel the criminal investigation that was now inevitable. Detective Kent studied the barrier like it was a crime scene, snapping photos of the electrified gate and the wire curling over the top. "Mr. Colt, this goes far beyond a property dispute," she said. "This is false imprisonment. Combine it with the fraud evidence from last night, and we're looking at multiple felony charges." Her tone was very different from when we first met. She was no longer a mediator in a petty neighborhood quarrel. She was now leading an investigation into a full-blown criminal enterprise. The real turning point came when Tommy uncovered something the construction crew hadn't meant to reveal. While trenching for electrical wiring, they disturbed several of the old survey markers Earl had described. When the county surveyor inspected the site, he confirmed what Earl had been saying for decades. The gleaming new gate stood squarely on Colt family land. Earl's eyes lit up with the kind of satisfaction that only comes from justice long delayed. "Son," he said quietly, "she just built her empire's grand finale on your grandfather's property." By midday, the story had exploded beyond our community. Property rights advocates, civil liberties groups, and countless survivors of HOA nightmares across the country rallied around the images of Tamara's fence. What was meant to cement her authority had become the ultimate symbol of everything wrong with unchecked HOA power. Tommy's livestream audience had swelled to over 50,000, with donations flooding in to help with legal costs. People weren't just watching, they were choosing sides. The final twist came when Marcus returned, court order in hand, authorizing the immediate removal of the fence. Under supervision, the very same construction crew that had erected Tamara's barricade was forced to dismantle it piece by piece. And then came the kicker. The high-tech gate she'd bragged about had been installed with the manufacturer's override code. At any point, we could have simply keyed it in and walked free. Tamara's fortress hadn't been a prison at all, just an empty show of power. The fence that was supposed to trap us turned out to be nothing more than an empty showpiece, the perfect symbol of the fake authority Tamara had been wielding for months. As the crews hauled away steel panels and coils of razor wire, I realized something strange. Tamara herself had vanished. The foreman, wiping sweat from his brow, approached me cautiously. "Sir, you should probably know a broken bar. The woman who hired us paid in cash." The address she gave turned out to be a vacant lot. He handed me a business card with fake contact details. "We tried calling her this morning when the police showed up, but every number was disconnected. No one seems to know where she actually lives." That revelation shifted the story from bizarre to unbelievable. The so-called Hope president of Pine Rest might not have even been a real resident. And just when we thought the chaos was over, Tommy unearthed something inside the gate's electronic control system that turned the entire case upside down. Buried in its memory banks was a list of addresses scattered across Colorado, each tagged with access codes. It looked less like a one-time stunt and more like the blueprint of a larger operation. Detective Kent acted immediately. The discovery drew in federal agencies, and before long, FBI agents were interviewing Earl about his memories of Jonathan Hayes's old network. The Colorado Attorney General's office soon launched what they dubbed Operation Boundary Shifter, an investigation into a decades-long conspiracy to steal property through fraudulent HOAs across more than a dozen communities. The truth unraveled quickly. Tamara Caldwell wasn't even real. The FBI identified her as Teresa Collins, a disgraced real estate developer who had been cycling through fake identities to infiltrate neighborhoods. She'd perfected a scheme of getting elected to HOA boards, manufacturing violations, and seizing homes for resale to developers. Pine Rest wasn't her first job, it was her third. Earl's testimony became pivotal. Watching him step out of the shadows of guilt into the role of star witness was incredible. The man who'd once carried a secret for 40 years now worked daily with federal investigators to identify other towns caught in Hayes's web. "Son, your grandfather would be proud," Earl told me after one interview. "This isn't just about setting Pine Rest right, we're making sure no one else goes through this nightmare." The restoration process became a celebration. Surveyors used Earl's old maps and the GPS data from my grandfather's files to restore accurate property lines for all 12 families wronged by Hayes's original scheme. Mrs. Patterson regained 3 acres of her family's land, which had been disguised as community green space. The Hendersons learned their property extended all the way to the creek, a land they'd been paying HOA fees to access for years. And as for us, the land beneath Tamara's rented house was rightfully returned to my family, expanding our inheritance to nearly 6 acres instead of a small cabin plot. Tommy documented every step, and his footage became the backbone of a film that later premiered at the Denver Film Festival, Stolen Ground: How HOAs Became Tools of Property Theft. The documentary not only won awards but also sparked legislative reform. Colorado passed new laws requiring independent verification of all property boundaries before an HOA could be legally established. The boy who once worried only about his father's land had grown into an advocate for property rights across the state. And the final twist came when federal agents finally caught up with Teresa Collins. They arrested her at Denver International Airport as she attempted to flee to Arizona, where she had already wormed her way onto yet another HOA board under a different identity. Her arrest uncovered even more similar scams already unfolding in 4 other states, each following the same fraudulent pattern of fake violations, falsified assessments, and stolen land. The schemes of manipulation and fraudulent land grabs we'd endured in Pine Rest turned out to be only one piece of a much larger puzzle. Teresa's arrest made national headlines, but by then the impact of our fight had already spread. New property rights laws were being passed in 8 states, and the FBI had launched investigations into HOA corruption across the country. Earl lived long enough to see justice fulfilled. 8 months after the fences came down, he passed away peacefully in his sleep. By then, every family in Pine Rest had their property restored. At his funeral, Detective Kent read aloud a letter Earl had written to my grandfather's grave via a promise kept after 4 decades. "I kept your evidence safe, old friend," it said, "and your grandson used it to save not just this community, but many more. Rest easy now. The debt is paid." Today, Pine Rest operates under a reformed HOA charter that requires every property claim to be publicly verified and bans compliance actions without independent legal review. My grandfather's cabin still stands where it always has, now securely surrounded by the 6 acres that were nearly stolen from us. Every morning, when I sit on that old wooden deck with a cup of coffee, I think of the journey that began with his courage to gather the evidence, and ended with Earl's courage to finally speak the truth. But the fight didn't end there. 6 months later, the FBI called again and they had uncovered evidence of similar fraud schemes in 23 states, all tied back to Hayes's original network. Families just like mine, with land passed down through generations, were being targeted by developers who thought they could rewrite history. The agents asked me to testify before Congress about HOA reform. What started as one family's battle over a cabin in the woods had become part of a nationwide reckoning. And for the first time, I understood, our story wasn't an ending, it was only the beginning.